In cinema, some performances linger far beyond their runtime, searing themselves into history with a power that outlasts entire films. Isabella Rossellini did it in The Conclave, 2024, delivering under 10 minutes of screen time that still earned her an Oscar nomination. But more than 3 decades earlier, Anthony Hopkins immortalized one of cinema's most terrifying villains in just 16 minutes. His role as Dr. Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs, 1991, remains the gold standard for psychological horror, and arguably the scariest performance in movie history. What made Lecter unforgettable wasn't violent outbursts or grotesque theatrics, but the chilling contrast between his polite exterior and the monstrosity lurking beneath. Hopkins chose not to study real-life killers, dismissing them as too distasteful. Instead, he built Lecter on a deceptively simple principle: to make a madman frightening, play him as ultra-sane. That decision gave rise to a villain whose stillness, intellect, and refinement made him scarier than any feral monster. Hopkins kept his body rigid and reptilian, moving only his head as if tracking prey. He never blinked on camera, his unbroken stare trapping both Clarice Starling and the audience in an unnerving psychological grip. Even his voice carried menace, calm, clipped, and eerily reminiscent of HAL 9000 from 2001, A Space Odyssey. When Lecter casually describes eating a man's liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti, the horror doesn't come from the words, but from the icy precision with which he delivers them. Director Jonathan Demme amplified this effect by building a myth around Lecter before he even appeared on screen. Starling, played by Jodie Foster, is warned repeatedly of his brilliance and danger before making the tense walk down a corridor of violent inmates to meet him. The payoff subverts expectations entirely. Instead of a raving lunatic, Lecter greets her with impeccable posture and unnerving courtesy. This inversion of the monster trope is what makes him instantly unforgettable. Though Lecter only appears for 16 minutes, his presence permeates the entire film. His first 7-minute encounter with Starling is a masterclass in psychological warfare. Hopkins dominates the scene with nothing more than his gaze, his measured speech, and his ability to probe Starling's vulnerabilities. Foster later admitted that she was genuinely frightened during their exchanges, calling him petrifying in character. What makes the performance remarkable is how Hopkins lingers even when absent. For much of the story, Lecter exists as a ghost in the machine, felt in every decision, feared in every shadow, and remembered in every word of dialogue exchanged with Clarice. His influence extends beyond his cell walls, manipulating events with intellect rather than brute force. It's proof that true cinematic presence isn't measured in minutes, but in impact. Hopkins' portrayal also reshaped the archetype of movie villains. Before Lecter, villains were often exaggerated maniacs or faceless predators. Hopkins introduced a new model: the cultured, articulate killer whose greatest weapon is his intellect. Hannibal Lecter is terrifying not because he's savage, but because he's civilized. He dissects minds as easily as bodies. His influence can be traced through countless successors, from John Doe in Say 7 to Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men. Even experts in criminology recognize the unnerving realism in Hopkins' performance. Psychiatrist Helen Morrison, who has studied real serial killers, said his charisma mirrored their ability to draw you in like a Venus flytrap. Criminologist David Wilson pointed out Lecter's manipulative need to size up Clarice before offering help, a trait seen in actual offenders. Yet both agreed the performance also takes liberties for drama, particularly Lecter's attachment to Clarice, something no real killer would form. That balance between psychological truth and theatricality is exactly why Lecter endures. In just 16 minutes, Hopkins blended realism with cinematic myth to create a villain who is both timeless and terrifying. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor, not Supporting Actor, despite his brief appearance, underscoring the sheer weight of his presence. 34 years later, The Silence of the Lambs still chills audiences not because of gore or jump scares, but because of a man who barely moves, rarely raises his voice, and never once loses control. Anthony Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter remains a reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who smile politely, speak softly, and see right through you. Sparkle's alternate titles you could use. Why Anthony Hopkins' 16-minute role as Hannibal Lecter is still the scariest in movie history. The silence that terrifies. How Hopkins redefined horror in just 16 minutes. Politeness, precision, and pure terror. The legacy of Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter.